author of The Adventure of the Twisted Truths and host of the Book and Dagger. Today, we're continuing our read-along of The Hobbit. And with probably my favorite chapter in the entire series, it is going to be Chapter 17, The Clouds Burst. So basically after Bilbo has given the Arkenstone to the Elven King and Bard, the next day, trumpets rang early in the camp. And a single runner comes along and he hails Thorin, and he asks if Thorin will listen to another embassy from the Elven King, since new tidings had come to hand and matters were changed. "That will be Danes," said Thorin when he heard. "They have got wind of his coming. I thought that would alter their mood. Bid them come few in number and weaponless, and then I will hear," he called to the messenger. So about midday, the banners of the forest and the lake were seen to be borne forth again. A company of 20 was approaching. At the beginning of the narrow way, they laid aside sword and spear and came on towards the gate. Wondering, the dwarves saw that among them were both Bard and the Elven King, before whom an old man wrapped in cloak and hood bore a strong casket of iron-bound wood. Bard says, "Hail, Thorin, are you still of the same mind?" Thorin says, "My mind does not change with the rising and setting of a few suns. Did you come to ask me idle questions? Still the elf host has not departed as I bade. Till then you come in vain to bargain with me. Is there nothing then for which you would yield any of your gold? Nothing that you or your friends have to offer." "What of the Arkenstone of Thrain?" said he, and at the same moment the old man opened the casket and held aloft the jewel. The light leapt from his hand, bright and white in the morning. Then Thorin was stricken dumb with amazement and confusion. No one spoke for a long time. Thorin at length broke the silence, and his voice was thick with wrath. "That stone was my father's and is mine," he said. "Why should I purchase my own?" But wonder overcame him, and he added, "But how come you by such an heirloom of my house, if there is need to ask such a question of thieves?" "We are not thieves," Bard answered. "Your own we will give back in return for our own." "How come you by it?" shouted Thorin in a gathering rage. "I gave it to them," squeaked Bilbo, who was peering over the wall, by now in a dreadful fright. You!" cried Thorin, turning upon him and grasping him with both hands. "You miserable hobbit! You undersized burglar!" he shouted, at a loss for words, and he shook poor Bilbo like a rabbit. "By the beard of Durn, I wish I had Gandalf here. Curse him for his choice of you. May his beard wither. As for you, I will throw you to the rocks," he cried, and he lifted Bilbo in his arms. "Stay! Your wish is granted," said a voice. The old man with the casket threw aside his hood and cloak. "Here is Gandalf, and none too soon, it seems. If you don't like my burglar, please don't damage him. Put him down and listen first to what he has to say." So then Thorin says, "Oh, you all seem to be in league," and he calls Bilbo a descendant of rats. And Bilbo says that, just says, "Dear me, I didn't think you'd be so mad." He says, "I took that jewel as my 14th share. You may consider that I have claimed my share and disposed of it, and the rest of everything else is yours." And Thorin says he'll let it go at that, and I'll let you go at that, and may we never meet again. They turned and spoke over the wall. "I am betrayed," he said. "It was rightly guessed that I could not forbear to redeem the Arkenstone, the treasure of my house. For it I will give 1/14th share of the hoard in silver and gold, setting aside the gems, but that shall be accounted the promised share of this traitor, and with that reward he shall depart, and you can divide it as you will. He will get little enough, I doubt not. Take him if you wish him to live, and no friendship of mine goes with him." So then he says, "Bill will get down," and Bill asks, "What about the gold?" And Thorin says, "That will be follow after until it can be arranged." Bard says, "Until then, we keep the stone." And Gandalf pops in and goes, "You are not making a very splendid figure as King of the Mountains," said Gandalf, "but things may change yet." "They may indeed," said Thorin, and already so strong was the bewilderment of the treasure upon him, he was pondering whether by the help of Dane he might not recapture the Arkenstone and withhold the share of the reward. And so Bilbo leaves, and a lot of the dwarves, more than one of the dwarves in their hearts felt shame and pity at his going, and feel ashamed that Thorin at the way Thorin sent Bilbo off, because Bilbo's helped them out and saved their lives so many times. Bilbo says, "Farewell, we may meet again as friends." "Be off," called Thorin. "You have mail upon you, which was made by my folk, and it is too good for you. It cannot be pierced by arrows, but if you do not hasten, I will sting your miserable feet. So be swift." "Not so hasty," said Bard. "We will give you until tomorrow. At noon we will return, and see if you have brought from the hoard the portion that is to be set against the stone. If that is done without deceit, then we will depart, and the elf host will go back to the forest. In the meantime, farewell." Anyway, so they leave, but Thorin sends messengers with ravens by Dane and tells him to hasten. The day passes, and the night, and the next day the winds shifted west, and the air was dark and gloomy. The morning was still early when a cry was heard in the camp. Runners came in to report that a host of dwarves had appeared around the eastern spur of the mountain and were now hastening to Dale. Dane had come. He had hurried on through the night, and so had come upon them sooner than expected. Each one of his folk was clad in a hauberk of steel mail that hung to his knees, and his legs were covered with hose of a fine and flexible metal mesh, the secret of whose making was possessed by Dane's people. Dwarves are exceedingly strong for their height, but most of these were strong even for dwarves. In battle, they wielded heavy two-handed mattocks, but each of them also had a short broadsword at his side and a round shield slung at his back. Trumpets called men and elves to arms. Before long, the dwarves could be seen coming up the valley at a great pace. Basically, they go out and they have a bard comes out with some of his men. They meet the dwarves, and the dwarves say, "We are sent from Dane, son of Nain. We are hastening to our kinsfolk in the mountain. But who are you who sit as foes before defended walls?" Which is, of course, they're basically saying, "You have no business being here. Get out of our way." Bard, of course, refuses to allow the dwarves to go straight onto the mountain because knows that if Dane and all his men go in there, they might, just Thor might refuse to give their share of the gold. He might try to attack and take the Arkenstone by force. So then Bard sends messengers to the gate after he's barred the dwarves away, but Thorin just shoots some arrows out, so they hurry back. And all the elves and men are getting ready for battle, for the dwarves of Dane are advancing along the eastern bank. Bard says they're fools to come thus beneath the mountain's arm. They do not understand war above ground, whatever they may know of battles in the mines. There are many of our archers and spearmen hidden in the rocks upon their right flank. Dwarf mail may be good, but they will soon be hard put to it. Let us set on them now from both sides, before they are fully rested. But the Elven King said, "Long will I tarry ere I begin this war for gold. The dwarves cannot pass us unless we will, or do anything that we cannot mark. Let us hope still for something that will bring reconciliation. Our advantage in numbers will be enough if in the end it must come to unhappy blows." But he reckoned without the dwarves. The knowledge that the Arkenstone was in the hands of the besiegers burned in their thoughts. Also, they guessed the hesitation of Bard and his friends and were resolved to strike when they debated. And then the dwarves suddenly attack, and so a battle starts to begin. But at that moment, darkness came on with dreadful swiftness, and a black cloud hurried over the sky. Winter thunder on a wild wind rolled roaring up and rumbled in the mountain, and lightning hit its peak. And beneath the thunder, another blackness could be seen whirling forward, but it did not come with the wind. It came from the north, like a vast cloud of birds, so dense that no light could be seen between their wings. Gandalf jumps forward and says, "Halt! Dread has come upon you all. Alas, it has come more swiftly than I guessed. The goblins are upon you. Bolg of the north is coming, O Dane, whose father you slew in Moria. Behold, the bats are above his army like a sea of locusts. They ride upon wolves, and wargs are in their train." Amazement and confusion fell upon them all. Even as Gandalf had been speaking, the darkness grew. The dwarves halted and gazed at the sky. The elves cried out with many voices. "Come," called Gandalf, "there is yet time for counsel. Let Dane, son of Nain, come swiftly to us." So began a battle that none had expected, and it was called the Battle of the Five Armies, and it was very terrible. Upon one side were the goblins and the wild wolves, and upon the other were elves and men and dwarves. This is how it fell out. Basically, ever since the fall of the Great Goblin, the goblins have been, their fury for dwarves has been made all the greater. So they've been sending out messages to all their goblins throughout the world, and they're all been assembling the mountains. And when they learned the death of Smog, they all think to capture the treasures. They all assembled a great army of goblins and wolves, and they all hastened towards there. But they also went through night through the mountains, so not even the ravens knew of their coming. And how much Gandalf knew cannot be said, but his plan that he had not expected the sudden assault. But this is the plan he made in council with the Elven King, with Bard, and with Dane, for the Dwarf Lord now joined them. The goblins were the foes of all, and at their coming all other quarrels were forgotten. Their only hope was to lure the goblins into the valley between the arms of the mountain, and themselves to man the great spurs that stuck south and east. Yet this would be perilous if the goblins were in sufficient numbers to overrun the mountain itself, and so attack them also from behind and above, but there was no time to make any other plan or to summon any help. "So to the mountain," called Bard, "to the mountain! Let us take our places while there is yet time." On the southern spur in its lowest slope, and in the rocks at its feet, the elves were set. On the eastern spur were men and dwarves. But Bard and some of the nimblest of men and elves climbed to the height of the eastern shoulder to gain a view of the north. Soon they could see the lands before the mountain's feet, black with a hurrying multitude. Ere long the vanguard swirled round the spur's end and came rushing into Dale. These were the swiftest wolf riders, and already their cries and howls rent the air afar. A few brave men were strung before them to make a feint of resistance, and many there fell back before the rest drew back and fled to either side. As Gandalf had hoped, the goblin army had gathered behind the resisted vanguard and poured now in rage into the valley, driving wildly up between the arms of the mountain, seeking for the foe. Their banners were countless, black and red, and they came on like a tide in fury and disorder. It was a terrible battle, the most dreadful of all Bilbo's experiences, and one to say which he hated the most, which is to say that he was the one he was most proud of, and most fond of recalling long afterward, though he was quite unimportant in it. Because basically he just put on his magic ring and vanished from sight early on in the battle, and basically didn't really do a whole lot because he was just standing next to Gandalf. But anyway, the elves were the first to charge. Their hatred for the goblins is cold and bitter. Their spears and swords shone in the gloom with a gleam of chill flame. So deadly was the wrath of the hands that held them. As soon as the host of their enemies was dense in the valley, they sent against it a shower of arrows, and each flickered as it fled, as if with stinging fire. Behind the arrows, 1,000 of their spearmen leapt down and charged. The yells were deafening. The rocks were stained black with goblin blood. Just as the goblins were recovering from the onslaught and the elf charge was halted, there rose from across the valley a deep-throated roar, with cries of "Moria!" and "Dane! Dane!" The dwarves of the Iron Hills plunged in, wielding their mattocks. Upon the other side, and beside them came the men of the lake with long swords. Panic came upon the goblins, and even as they turned to meet this new attack, the elves charged again with renewed numbers. Already many of the goblins were flying back down the river to escape from the trap, and many of their own wolves were turning upon them and rending the dead and the wounded. Victory seemed at hand when a cry rang out from the heights above. Goblins had scaled the mountain from the other side, and already many were on the slopes above the gate, and others were streaming down recklessly, heedless of those that fell screaming from cliff and precipice to attack the spurs from above. Each of these could be reached by paths that ran down from the main mass of the mountain in the center, and the defenders had too far to bar the way for long. Victory now vanished from hope. They had only stemmed the first onslaught of the black tide. Day grew on. The goblins gathered again in the valley. Then a host of wargs came ravening, and with them came the bodyguard of Bold, goblins of huge size with scimitars of steel. Soon actual darkness was coming into a stormy sky, while still the great bats swirled about the heads and ears of elves and men, or fastened vampire-like on the stricken. Now Bard was fighting to defend the eastern slope, and yet giving slowly back, and the elf lords were at bay about the king upon the southern arm, near to the watch-post on Ravenhill. Suddenly there was a great shout, and from the gate came a trumpet call. They had forgotten Thorin. Part of the wall, moved by levers, fell outward with a crash into the pool. Out leapt the king of the mountain, and his companions followed him. Hood and cloak were gone. They were in shining armor, and red light leapt from their eyes. In the gloom the great dwarf gleamed like gold in a dying fire. Rocks were hurled down on high by the goblins above, but they held on, leapt down to the fall's foot, and rushed forward to battle. Wolf and rider fell or fled before them. Thorin wielded his axe with mighty strokes, and nothing seemed to harm him. To me, elves and men! To me, O my kinsfolk! He cried, and his voice shook like a horn in the valley. Down, heedless of order, rushed all the dwarves of Dane to his help. Down, too, came many of the lakemen, for Bard could not restrain them, and out upon the other side came many of the spearmen of the elves. Once again the goblins were stricken in the valley, and they were piled in heaps till Dale was dark and hideous with their corpses. The wargs were scattered, and Thorin drove right against the bodyguard of Bold, but he could not pierce their ranks. Already behind him among the goblin dead lay many men and many dwarves, and many a fair elf that should have lived long ages merrily in the wood. And as the valley widened, his onset grew ever slower. His numbers were too few. His flanks were unguarded. Soon the attackers were attacked, and they were forced into a great ring, facing every way, hemmed all about with goblins and wolves returning to the assault. The bodyguard of Bold came howling against them and drove them in upon their ranks like waves upon cliffs of sand. Their friends could not help them, for the assault upon the mountain was renewed with redoubled force, and upon either side men and elves were slowly being beaten down. And Bilbo was looking upon all this with misery. He is upon Ravenhill with the elves, partially because there was more chance of escape from this point, and partially because, in the more Tookish part of his mind, because if he was going to be in a last desperate stand, he preferred on the whole to defend the Elven King. Gandalf, too, I may say, was there, sitting on the ground as if in deep thought, preparing, I suppose, some last blast of magic before the end. That did not seem far off. It will not be long now, thought Bilbo, before the goblins win the gate and we are all slaughtered or driven down and captured. Really, it is enough to make one weep after all one has gone through. I would rather old Smog have been left with all the wretched treasure than that these vile creatures should get it, and poor old Bombur and Balin and Fili and Kili and all the rest come to a bad end, and Bard too, and the Lakemen and the Merry Elves. Misery me! I have heard songs of many battles, and I have always understood that defeat may be glorious. It seems very uncomfortable, not to say distressing. I wish I was well out of it. The clouds were torn by the wind, and a red sunset slashed the west. Seeing the sudden gleam in the gloom, Bilbo looked around. He gave a great cry. He had seen a sight that made his heart leap, dark shape, small yet majestic against the distant glow. "The eagles! The eagles!" he shouted. "The eagles are coming!" Bilbo's eyes were seldom wrong. The eagles were coming down the wind, line after line, in such a host as must have gathered from all the eyries of the north. "The eagles!" Bilbo cried, dancing and waving his arms. If the elves could not see him, they could hear him. Soon they too took up the cry, and it echoed across the valley. Many wondering eyes looked up, though as yet nothing could be seen except from the southern shoulders of the mountain. The eagles! Cried Bilbo once more, but at that moment a stone hurtling from above smote heavily on his helm, and he fell with a crash and knew no more. That is the end of chapter 17. We'll be back with chapter 18 soon.